Continuing on Chapter 3 regarding ecosystems, let's focus on the nutrient cycling that occurs within the ecosystem. The term associated with nutrient cycling is biogeochemical cycling, and this is driven by the sun's energy as well as the Earth's gravitation. And it continually is moving nutrients and energy through the air, through the water, through the soils, the rocks, and through living organisms. So, matter in the form of nutrients and energy is naturally cycled and recycled through the ecosystem and the biosphere. There's a one-way flow of energy, as we mentioned, with the different trophic levels in a food web, yet there's a cycling of matter. And a couple of the geochemical cycles that we're going to look at are the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle, which isn't depicted on this figure, but it is one that we're going to look at. So let's touch base on the carbon cycle. Carbon is the basic building block of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, DNA, and other compounds. Carbon actually circulates through the biosphere, the hydrosphere being the water portion, and the atmosphere. So, producers via photosynthesis, consumers and decomposers via aerobic respiration circulate carbon in the biosphere. Now, our main focus with the carbon cycle for this course will be carbon dioxide, which is considered a primary climate change gas. CO2 makes up a really small percentage of the atmosphere based on volume. And the major cycle processes for carbon dioxide and the carbon cycle is the aerobic respiration, which would happen with decomposers, the photosynthesis, which occurs with producers, and then the man-made influence is through fossil fuel combustion and deforestation. By the way, when we burn fossil fuels, it adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and contributes to climate change. So this is a diagram depicting the global carbon cycle, and it's a simplified model showing the circulation of various chemical forms of carbon throughout the carbon cycle. So the light blue colored boxes indicate a process such as diffusion and respiration, decomposition, compaction, respiration, and photosynthesis. These are all representing processes within the carbon cycle. The yellow indicates a reservoir, meaning where carbon is stored. So carbon dioxide is stored in the oceans, and it circulates through the marine food webs. Also, carbon dioxide can be stored in the atmosphere and in plants as well as animals. The red arrows indicate pathways affected by humans, such as transportation, deforestation, forest fires, and burning of fossil fuels. The blue arrows represent natural pathways of carbon cycling through this geochemical cycle. So, how do we impact the carbon cycle? Well, you've heard a lot about fossil fuels already in this course, so by extracting them and burning them, we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And by clear-cutting forests faster than they can regrow, we basically impact the carbon-absorbing vegetation on Earth. So this is a graphic depicting carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. This is the concentration on the y-axis, and the time frame is from the 1900s to the year 2000. And the graph is depicting global carbon dioxide levels and how they've increased over time from 1900 to 2000 over a 100-year time frame. And then this graphic is a continuation in parts per million from 2006 to 2017. So we have seen an increase in carbon dioxide, and we're currently at about the 400 part per million level, whereas we were at about 300 parts per million back in the 1900s. This is another graphic that depicts the carbon dioxide concentration over a longer time frame, basically the years before 1950. So this is 1950, and this is 50,000 years prior to 1950, 100,000 years prior to 1950, 200,000 years prior to 1950. This data was acquired from historic ice core analysis. And you can see that historically there's been fluctuations in carbon dioxide. It peaked at about 300 parts per million, about 300,000 years prior to 1950. It was as high as 280, about 250,000 years before 1950, and it came back up to about 280 again. What we're seeing in the trends, though, is from 1950 on, we're seeing an increasing level where it's not declining at all. And that can be represented by these graphs here. We're continuing to see this increase occur in carbon dioxide levels. So that's where there's a concern that humans, are contributing to increased CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere from our activities. This graphic is depicting the largest producers of carbon dioxide emissions from the year 2015. China leads all countries in carbon dioxide emissions with about 28%, and the United States is coming in second, around 16%. Now, keep in mind that the United States has about 326 million people living in it, and China has about 1.4 million people. So the population of China is about 4 times larger than that of the United States. India is actually also about 4 times larger in population, and they're ranked third in CO2 emissions. So the question then comes, what is causing these countries to be highest in CO2 emissions? Well, one factor for China is the number of coal-burning power plants that they utilize in order to provide electricity to the people that live in China. That's also a contributing factor in the United States, but our affluence and high use of resources contributes to our CO2 emissions here in the United States as well. So let's look at the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle, there's some key terms here: nitrogen fixation and nitrification, ammonification, and denitrification. So nitrogen gas is N2, and it makes up about 78% of the atmosphere and cannot be used directly by most living organisms. So instead what happens is nitrogen goes through some reaction phases in order to be used by living organisms. So the nitrogen cycle includes the following steps. Specialized bacteria actually converts the gaseous nitrogen, N2, into ammonia in nitrogen fixation. Then you can also have a specialized bacteria that converts the ammonia in the soil to nitrite ions and nitrate ions, and those ions, nitrite and nitrate, are used as plants as a nutrient to help the plant grow. This process is called nitrification. Then you can have decomposers, or bacteria that decompose the material, and they convert detritus into ammonia and water-soluble salts during a process of what's called ammonification. And then finally, in denitrification, we have bacteria that live in oxygen-deficient environments or anaerobic environments, maybe like in a swamp or wetland or bottom sediment in water areas. And these anaerobic bacteria convert the ammonia ions back into nitrite and nitrate ions, and then into nitrogen gas, and then that is put back into the atmosphere. So these are the different steps that occur through the nitrogen cycle. And this is a diagram of the nitrogen cycle, a simplified model, and again, similar color coding as to what we saw with the carbon cycle. So ways in which we release nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere are from burning fossil fuels and automobiles, transportation. We also get nitrates released into the environment from putting fertilizer on our crops, and commercial nitrogen fertilizer as well. So let's look at the phosphorus cycle. Interesting fact about the phosphorus cycle is that it does not cycle through the atmosphere. It cycles through soils and rocks and water and plants, but not through the atmosphere. The major reservoirs or storage of phosphorus on Earth are in rock formations and ocean bottom sediments. So we find phosphorus in actual rock formations and sediments. Phosphorus is transferred by food webs and is an important component of many biological molecules. It's also a limiting factor in plant growth. And as with nitrogen, it contributes to agricultural runoff issues when there's too much phosphorus coming off of farms. This is a diagram of the phosphorus cycle, and the red indicates the major human impacts. So phosphorus from mining waste and runoff can impact water quality, phosphates in sewage, and phosphates in fertilizer as well. Okay, so let's look at the sulfur cycle. Most sulfur is stored in rocks and minerals, and it can enter the atmosphere through different modes, and we'll look at a diagram that depicts this. So one way is through volcanic eruptions, where hydrogen sulfide gas is emitted during the actual volcanic eruption, and sulfur dioxide as well. Anaerobic decomposition in swamps, bogs, or tidal flats results in hydrogen sulfide being emitted, and it kind of smells like rotten eggs a little bit, as well as from sea spray, dust storms, and obviously forest fires. So this is a simplified diagram of the sulfur cycle, and notice the red depicts human impact. So mining and extraction can release sulfur into the environment. Smelting, burning of coal, and refining fossil fuels can emit sulfur dioxides into the atmosphere, and then that can actually react in the atmosphere to create a sulfuric acid that contributes to acid rain. So let's look at acid rain a little bit. Nitrogen and sulfur emissions are what contributes to acid rain. Acid rain is a term that's used to describe rainfall or precipitation that comes from the atmosphere that has large quantities of acidic components. The atmospheric deposition often comes in the form of rain, snow, sleet, hail, fog, and even some particulate matter. So what basically happens is that as sulfur dioxides and nitrogen dioxides are released into the atmosphere from human activities, they react in the atmosphere and create weak acids such as nitric acid and strong acids such as sulfuric acid. This graphic is depicting nitrogen oxide emissions in New England area from 2002 and where the source of those emissions are coming from. So about 12% is coming from non-point sources, and then this blue area depicts the industrial point sources. 17% is coming from off-road engines, but a majority of our nitrogen oxide emissions are coming from car engines or transportation engines. Now, as far as sulfur dioxide emissions, most of it's coming from industrial point sources like coal-burning power plants or some kind of industry that's emitting sulfur dioxide. And less is coming from cars and automobiles. So I do want to categorize the source of emissions into three groups. First is a point source. Point source refers to a stationary location, easy to pick out. Usually factories or power plants or pipes that discharge into a stream are called point sources. Non-point sources are area sources but are small and distributed over an area, so it's difficult to point them out and know exactly what's coming from them. Then you also have mobile sources, which are vehicles. Mobile sources such as boats, airplanes, agricultural equipment, lawnmowers, and automobiles. So at this point, we're going to wrap up this short video lesson, and then I'll continue in the next video lesson to discuss acid rain and how that occurs in relation to the sulfur and the nitrogen cycle.